Okay, everybody, we're going to get started, and happy to have you here with me on this afternoon. And I have to say, I'm pretty fired up. Emotional intelligence is still a topic that is, we'll say, catching on in corporate America, and it's one that I'm extremely passionate about. I practice it daily. I think about it all the time, and I really, really enjoy teaching it. And this webinar had a waiting list, and this is the first time I've ever had a webinar that had a waiting list. So hopefully that's reflective of the fact that interest in emotional intelligence is increasing and people are really valuing the skill set regardless of the COVID-19 crisis. So thanks for being here. I hope everybody is happy, healthy, and safe during the crisis. And I just want to make a comment before we get started. I feel virtual learning is really difficult. And people have a tendency, in my experience, and this is feedback I've received just with colleagues and training I've done, that we have a tendency to be multitasking when we're virtual learning as opposed to in person. So I'm really encouraging people to be present and mindful, especially for this topic. Please shut your cell phones off. Please don't look at your email, close out your email if you need to, and just be present. It's only a 45-minute webinar, and I promise you, you will take a lot out of this webinar today. So whenever I do training, I like the people that I'm training to have goals, and I have goals, and I want you to be very picky. I want you to really think about what you want to get out of this today, because my goal when I do what you see on the screen are the goals I have whenever I do training with everybody. And I really hope that I certainly stimulate some thought and you become more self-aware of a lot of things we're talking about. But really, I'm hoping that you feel confident to apply some of these techniques and strategies to respond and not react by the time we're done. A little bit about me. I started Mindset Go about 5.5 years ago. The idea when I started the company was I just feel that we are all facing a deficit in face-to-face communication skills. Ironically, that's happening now more than ever. And I actually, as a side note, I really resent the term social distancing. I think it's really not accurate. It's really physical distancing. And I think we have a hard enough time connecting with each other these days as it is. And the word social distancing really stigmatizes that even more. With that said, my passion is really to help people become confident and effective communicators. And I really identified the ingredients to my teaching are based on 3 fundamental components of intelligence. One is emotional intelligence, one is multi-generational intelligence, and one is conversational intelligence. And I feel like if you really understand those 3 aspects of learning, you can really be happy and successful personally and professionally. Now, this slide you're looking at right now, I'm going to share a very brief story with you that really has been a real game changer for me in my life. I'm a big believer in vulnerability. I'm a fan of Brene Brown. I'm actually, frankly, referred to often as the male version of Brene Brown. And with that said, I see a therapist, and I have for several years. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable admitting that, especially in my line of work, but I don't mind admitting it because it's been a boon. It's made me become a better father. It's made me become a better brother, trainer, coach, speaker, you name it. It's helped me in so many ways. And one of the best pieces of advice I got from my therapist is be curious. And it really matters so much to what we're talking about today, because we live in an era where we're making snap judgments all the time. We really lack attention span, and we make snap judgments often to protect ourselves. We default to certain assumptions. We default to assuming intent of others. And the idea of being curious is a phrase that I encourage you all, when this is over today, to write that down, have it on your nightstand, have it in your office, have it on your phone, because every time you have an opportunity to solve a problem, read a situation, make decisions, choose your actions, if your first step is being curious before you proceed, it'll help you immensely. And as we go through this today, this will make more sense. So what I'd like to cover today is, and I always have a pretty ambitious agenda, so hopefully we'll get through all these, but want to kind of take you quickly through the foundation of emotional intelligence, the difference between reacting and responding, what gets in the way, triggers, the acronym PLACE as a solution to problem solving of reacting versus responding, core communication ingredients, and steps for a mindful thought process. So as I mentioned before about emotional intelligence, you know, when we're in school and we grow up and we start out in school, we're often judged by our grades. And then our grades apparently are how people identify and assess how smart you are. And it's always fascinated me because IQ and grades are supposed to be a predictor of success in life and happiness in life. And multiple studies have been done that show that not only is that inaccurate, but it's really about a 10% predictor of success. And by the way, my 13-year-old son's sitting next to me watching this webinar, and I'm sure he's going to use that against me when we're done the webinar. But in all honesty, IQ and EQ is what we're finding out more and more is the predictor to success and effective leadership. There are 5 components of EQ, and 2 of the 5 we're going to really focus on today with this Respond React webinar. One of them is self-awareness, and self-awareness is basically the concept of how you see yourself, how others see you, where your confidence and self-esteem come from, how others perceive you, things like that. Self-control is how you respond and conduct yourself in situations, especially when facing adversity, anger, conflict, things like that. So your ability to be self-aware and recognize when certain things are happening is self-awareness. Your ability to make the right choice when they are happening is self-control. So I mentioned about curiosity before. I want everybody to take 30 seconds. I'm not the type to read off slides, but I'm going to give everybody, you know, a few seconds just to read these, and I'm going to quickly cover the significance of them. So we often talk about core competencies in the workplace in certain industries as leaders. And these are really the key core competencies to be able to respond and not react. So the concept of being curious, your default reaction is to not assume, it's to be empathetic and understand another person's perspective. And the curiosity is, geez, I wonder why this person said what they said. I wonder why they're acting the way they're acting. And if you can have a default reaction to be curious and wonder, that's huge. The second aspect is patience. And let's face it, we're all busy. Everybody likes to tell everybody how busy they are. It's a badge of courage to tell someone else how busy you are, because of course, when you're busy, it means you must be really successful at your job, and because you have so much going on in your life and everything's happening. But that's a major aspect of emotional intelligence, is the ability to do what you're doing, but also slow down long enough to recognize, are these the right things to do? Are these the right choices to make? And if I had a nickel for everybody who came to me and told me how much they struggle with time management and procrastination, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's the ability to say, wait a minute, I'm not getting the things I need done, or I'm not prioritizing what I need done because those tasks aren't appealing to me or aren't going to give me a peace of mind. So that's the second one. And the third one is clearly just the willingness to hear someone else's point of view before making that choice. Because if you start off closed-minded and making those assumptions, you're frankly already behind the eight ball, and your ability to connect with another human being or react to a specific situation is drastically impacted. So here's how it works. Basically, reactions are when you don't have a filtering process. It's basically when you're on autopilot. And the simplest way to explain it is when you're doing things without thinking and you don't consider the implications of your actions. So let's face it, we have four ways we can behave, right? We can be assertive, we can be aggressive, we can be passive, or we could be passive aggressive. So when someone does something, or when you're encountering a situation or a person that upsets you, if you react, you don't really think about what you're doing and you just go on autopilot and you just take an action without thinking it through. And you know, as funny as this is, you know, the analogy I would give you, it's like an untrained puppy who barks at every dog he or she sees, or every time he or she sees food on the table, he jumps up on the table, or she jumps up on the table. That's an untrained puppy, and that's a puppy that's reacting and not responding. So think about times in your life, as you're going through this webinar today, think about times in your life where you handled a situation a certain way. And maybe a day later, a week later, a month later, in hindsight, you said, geez, I wish I hadn't handled it that way, or boy, I could have handled that better. That's what we're talking about. That's essentially the difference of reacting as opposed to responding. And you know what makes this so hard is when times are good, it's much easier to do it. But there are so many things that cause us to react and not respond. Think of this laundry list for a second. Bad news. When we're under pressure, when we're feeling overwhelmed, when we're criticized, when we're accused of something, when we have to endure a setback. I mean, the list goes on and on. So emotional intelligence, when those situations come up, the question is, can you react versus respond? And I was doing some research on this topic a while back, and there was a study by NYU, which was just so ridiculous. And the study basically said that we make a judgment of a situation or a person in 30 milliseconds. And we do that because essentially our brain is trying to protect us. And I have another one of the modules in the emotional intelligence training I do is fight, flight, freeze, face. And our brain is trained to protect us. And so that's gets in the way of responding and not reacting because our brain is getting in the way and trying to protect us. Now, for those of you who saw the image I used to promote this workshop, and I don't know how many of, I'm hoping a lot of you are fans of Seinfeld, but we call this webinar, Can You Spare a Square? And what's interesting is in the great toilet paper scare of 2020, we saw so many people reacting and not responding. And what's interesting about it is there's two ways that could have been handled, right? So what did people do? They panicked. They raced out to the store and bought obsessive amounts of toilet paper. Why? Why? There's just as many people sitting at home going, I don't understand what the big deal is. So what causes a reaction like that? What causes people to become obsessive to the point we saw so many clips of people in stores fighting over toilet paper and carriages full and so on and so forth. And so that was a reaction that was so irrational. And the difference is if you were a person that was responding to that situation, here's what you would have done. Here's what this thought process looks like. You would have First, you would have determined how much toilet paper you had and maybe made an assessment on how long it's going to last. And an extension of that is, if you thought your toilet paper supply would last 2 weeks and the fear was there isn't any toilet paper, keep in mind, if you're racing out to the store to buy toilet paper, you're also telling yourself that you don't think there's going to be toilet paper in the store even 2, 3, and 4 weeks later. So it's twofold, no pun intended. The second thing is, how much do you realistically need for you and your family? So when you're making a decision and you're filling your wagon, do you really need all that much? Or is it just irrational? I better get as much as I can just in case something horrible happens and there's an apocalypse. The third is, what alternatives can you use for toilet paper? And look, I mean, I use this example because there's tons of alternatives to toilet paper. There's tissues, there's wipes, you could take a shower, there's all kinds of things. So the moral to this story is, those are 3 thought process steps a person could have taken before they panicked and raced out to the store to buy the toilet paper. But one of the important concepts I want you to take away in this webinar is, why did people do that? Why the irrational behavior? Why the panic? Why the fear? And a big part of that is, so many of us struggle with the fear of unknown. And so remember that "be curious" phrase I gave. What would happen in a case like that is, if you recognized the root cause, okay, the root cause of why you were panicking, if you were able to stop in that moment and go, wait a second, do I really need to be worried about this? What's going on? And if you could identify why you were panicked, is it really about the toilet paper, or is it about a fear of the unknown? Is it about a loss of control because you can't control how you're safe and protected? Or is it about the pandemic itself and all the fears that go with the pandemic for yourself, for your friends and the family, that indirectly are triggering a loss of control? And so the question is, would it matter? You know, for those of you attending today, if you had the thought process to stop and say, wait a minute, what is this really about? This is about, I'm worried. And you could actually identify the emotion you were feeling. And if you're able to identify the emotion, identify what the real root cause of the emotion is, how would that make a difference for you? Would it change your behavior? And what's interesting is, I'm going to give you a very short anecdote of an experience I had with an executive in an organization. It was more like a manager, supervisor level leader. And we were in a training, and he said to me one time, he said, you know, one of my frustrations is I have this employee that often comes back late from lunch. And no matter how many times I tell him, he continues to come back late from lunch. And I said, you know what, that's not why you're upset that he's coming back late from lunch. He said, yes, it is. And I said, no, it isn't. And he said, okay, why am I upset? And he said, I said, well, maybe it's because you've said it to him multiple times and he's still disregarding what you're saying. And so the repetition is bothering you. And he's like, yeah, you're right. That's what it is. I said, no, that's actually not what it is either. And he said, okay, what is it? And I said, what it is the root cause of what's going on here is you feel disrespected. You've given a request, you've given a demand, an order, call it whatever you want, and the person is disregarding the order. So part of the react and respond and understanding the root cause of behavior is, when someone acts a certain way to you, what is the intent of their action? Is their intent to annoy you and frustrate you and get under their skin? It may be, but most of the time it's probably not that. Most of the time people get wrapped up in their own worlds and their own habits and behaviors and routines. And the point I'm making is that understanding the root cause of why you act the way you do and why others act the way they do is really the first step in shifting your transition to respond and not react. So you have choices, right? You have choices you can make. That's what this whole webinar is about. What choice do you want to make in handling people and handling situations? And the choices you have is, I call this responsibility. And responsibility is your ability to make a response, to create a response. And it's pretty difficult, because when someone upsets you or something upsets you and you've been triggered, or you perceive it was about you, your ability to take a step back and make that choice is not easy. And I just want to emphasize, as I go through this webinar today, so much of what I'm talking about is very difficult. And I'm not saying that to pacify you. I'm saying it because it truly is. If you think of the skills or qualities in your life that you've mastered and that you excel at, I think we would all agree that that didn't happen by accident. It took a lot of practice. It took a lot of caring. It took a lot of passion. It took a lot of positive feedback and reinforcement. All those things contribute to our confidence in our skill levels and our characteristics. So to be emotionally intelligent is a skill set that is a very vast skill set that takes a lot of components, but it also is a skill set, like anything else, takes a lot of practice. And I want to reiterate this because a lot of people set very unreasonable standards for themselves. And emotional intelligence and reacting versus responding isn't about being perfect. We don't have to apologize for our emotions. We don't have to apologize for being angry. We can actually recognize that we are justified in being upset. So this is not about suppressing emotions or feeling like you have to walk on eggshells or, tap dance around everybody. This is about feeling emotions and knowing the most effective way to express the emotions, and really identifying the outcomes you're hoping to achieve when you do indeed express those emotions. So what's involved in that? Well, two things are involved in that. First of all, it's being mindfully present when responding, so you notice what's triggering you. And the second one's really important because it's about distancing yourself from the experience and watch your mind react to it. Now that might sound a little silly and corny to you, but I'm going to make a perfect analogy for you. Think about in the past, in certain relationships you've had in your life, when people have frustrated you. And think about times when you've needed some time to walk away and cool down, whether that's a minute, an hour, a day, whatever the appropriate time is. You've done it. What are you doing? You're distancing yourself from the situation so you can cope with your emotions and really control your reaction. Well, that's what being mindful is, and that's what we're talking about. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term mindfulness, and I'm going to cover this a little bit more as we go through the webinar, but being mindful is really just being present with what's going on. If you're being mindful during this webinar today, you're not thinking about what happened yesterday. You're not thinking about what you did this morning that went well or poorly. You're not thinking about what you have to do after this webinar is over. You're locked in on learning and taking valuable tools away. That's what being mindful is. And so the ability to distance yourself from a situation and look, stop, think, act. That's what we're talking about. Just stop. And I've spoken with a lot of people who will tell me, they'll say, Mark, honestly, what you're asking me to do, like, that's not how human interactions go. By the time you stop and formulate your thoughts and understand someone's intention and how you want to respond and what your goal is and all the different steps that go with it, it just seems like it would take a long time, and it doesn't. It just doesn't. Think of how quickly you form thoughts in your mind today when you're making those snap judgments. We see a lot of people in professional situations, and I'm going to preface my comments by saying I don't agree with these judgments, but they exist and they're common. Tall people are intimidating. Quiet people don't have a personality. Fat people are lazy. These are all assumptions we make, and we immediately, we create filters in our head right away that really interfere with a clear thought process. So the idea here is to pause, the power of pause, and really recognize what we want to do in a situation or dealing with a person where we're taken out of our comfort zone or we're quote unquote rattled. Okay. Now, a good example of this is emails. So think about when you receive an email that it doesn't have to, it can anger you, it can upset you, it can disappoint you, it can feel condescending, it can rub you the wrong way. So what happens when we get an email like that? Well, we all have different reactions. Some of us can't wait to hit that keyboard and start replying and give people a piece of their mind. Some of us will look at it, read it a couple of times and see if there could have been a few hidden meanings in there or clear meanings in there. But I bring up this example of written communication because what I always advise people to do when they read an email that impacts them or rattles them is I actually have them, after they read the email, walk away and come back and read it again 15 minutes later or an hour later or a day later. And I've been told almost invariably that when people take the time when they're about to make a snap judgment and react to a situation and they walk away and come back, not only do they have a different perspective, but they themselves, but they can also start to recognize the different meanings of the email as opposed to the first snap judgment they've made. I know a lot of coaches encourage people to deal with their emotions and to respond and not react by actually typing out what you feel like saying, just so you can articulate and verbalize your thoughts, but not actually send the email. And I think that can be an effective way of coping. But the point being that a lot of times in life, we know the right way to do things. We know the right way to handle things. You know, in my own life, I see it all the time. I have yet to be able to formulate an exercise routine. And when I have been able to exercise and be active in my life, I can tell you virtually every time I feel better, I have more energy, it makes my mood better. So I know the results. I know it's the right thing to do, but I can't formulate the habit yet. Well, that's what we're talking about for reacting and responding. You know, there have been situations in your life where you've regretted an action, or when you've taken the times you have been able to cool off and think things through, you know the result is almost always better. But again, how come you can't do it consistently? You know, if we know the right way, if we know the results, the proof's there, how come we can't do it? Well, the answer is triggers. And I'm sorry for the brightness of that slide, but the answer is triggers. And I want to explain first what triggers are. And before I explain what they are, I want to share that there's a lot of stigma around the word triggers. You know, people really associate triggers with trauma or therapy or mental health, as if those are bad things, but there's an immediate stigma that goes with the word trigger. I mean, I've done a lot of workshops with leaders. I work with sports teams in schools. And as soon as I say it, I look across the room and I see people rolling their eyes. But the fact is, if you take the word trauma, trauma has a lot of different meanings. Trauma does not, PTSD and trauma don't have to mean recovering from being in war. You could have experienced certain things in your life that were very traumatic, and that is experiencing trauma. And triggers are basically behaviors that we learned either through childhood or through life experience. And I often refer to, a lot of you who sat through my training before have heard me refer to the shoe bomber mindset. And the shoe bomber mindset is, you know, millions of flights have taken place in the history of the world, but a guy walks on a plane, he has a shoe bomb, and now we're all taking off shoes for the rest of our lives. So there was an incredible, it's like the toilet paper scare. There's an incredible overreaction. And it's so, again, it's so irrational because the likelihood, now that there's been such an overcompensation for shoe bombs, the likelihood that someone, a terrorist, tries to get on a plane and does that exact same method again is probably negligible because that method is protected against. So the point I'm making is that when we experience negative things, we get fired from a job, we have a terrible boss, we have someone that is verbally, physically, or emotionally abusive. I mean, those are pretty extreme examples, but even minor examples, a significant other breaks up with us that we really cared for. Those experiences don't leave us. We have a tendency to really remember the negative experiences more than the positive experiences. And frankly, there are situations where we may have experienced something successful 9 times out of 10. But if the 10th one was particularly painful, that's the one we hold on to, and that's the one we remember. And when we face crisis in difficult situations and difficult people, the first thought that comes to our head is our negative experience, not, oh, but this must be an outlier, or this must be a fluke, or this must be about someone else. No, because once we recognize those childhood or past life experiences, we lock in on them. And you know, in sales, as an example, for those of you who are small business owners or salespeople, I mean, we're all salespeople, frankly, regardless of what our job, but that's for another day. Salespeople get very triggered by objections. So let's say you're approaching a prospect and the prospect says, oh, you know what, that's the way we've already done it. Or that's the way we've always done it, excuse me. Or, you know what, could you just send me some information? All the obstacles and rejections that salespeople receive, they've heard it so many times before. So when a salesperson hears some form of rejection that they're used to hearing, the question is, can they respond or will they react? And by the way, I want to really stress the point that reaction doesn't have to be outward. Reaction can be inward, because just because you're not verbalizing or showing through body language your level of frustration and pain, it shows. And if your inner voice, if you're not addressing your thought process in your inner voice, that's going to give away a reaction instead of a response as well. So that's the thing. So now that you know what triggers are, okay, I want you to think for a second and ask yourself, have you ever acted on your anger, said something you didn't mean? And assuming you answered yes, which I would think is most of us, as I asked you before, can you think of a specific situation where you stepped back and you reacted or you responded in a better way because you stepped back? And then think of the opposite. Think of a time you reacted because you didn't take the time to think and pause and be mindful. And as we talk more about triggers, the reason why in some situations you're able to do it, in some situations you're not, is because of triggers. Because certain things impact us in a certain way. Certain people impact us in a certain way. Once we have experiences with human beings and once they behave a certain way, it's very hard to change that perception. For example, think about when you were back in school, in grade school. Think about the kid that was always goofing around in class or interrupting in class. That kid, if he does it 2, 3, or 4 times, that teacher is going to start to recognize and label that student as a distraction. And now, just inherently, our thought process starts to look for that stuff. So for the student to change that teacher's perception at that point is incredibly difficult, because even the slightest hint of distraction is going to trigger that teacher, and that is what the teacher has become used to. So that's the difference. The difference is, what is your level of experience in this situation or with this person to know how severely you're going to be triggered? And frankly, with this pandemic, this is such foreign territory for all of us. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to react or respond because there's such a fear of the unknown. There does not appear to be a light at the end of the tunnel of when this is going to end, which is even more reason that you get in touch with your thought process and really understand how to respond and not react. Now, I can tell you, as an example, from a self-awareness perspective, I can tell you a few of my triggers. One of them is service. It boggles my mind to this day where I can go into a restaurant or go into a retail store or go into someone where people's livelihoods depend on service, and you get bad service. And so that's a trigger for me. And part of triggers also come from not being able to understand a different perspective. Because again, if I'm in a restaurant and the waiter or waitress whose livelihood depends on a tip is giving bad service, then, on one hand, I could say to myself, what's wrong with this person? Like, what's their deal? I can't believe they don't understand the fundamental concept of service. But if I was doing what I've talked about in this webinar, I would take a different perspective. And I would be curious and I would say, wow, that person, they may be having a bad day, or that person, just may not have been trained effectively or something. And I think it's really important as you're listening to this today is, for those of you who know me pretty well, I'm not one to give people get out of jail free cards. I'm not one to just give excuses. I don't like excuses. I don't give excuses. I don't like excuses. I don't allow excuses in my household. But there's a difference between an excuse and an explanation. And we're not going to get into that. That's a different program I do called Blameless Autopsy. But there is a difference between excuse and explanation. And it's important that you recognize that difference, because if you're going to be mindful, if you're going to try to understand someone else's perspective and stop before you respond, then there's some baggage there. And if someone's giving you an explanation, you immediately default to an excuse, that will also get in the way. So those are some of my triggers. And what I want to talk about is understanding, recognizing, and managing triggers for a moment, because really it all comes down to pressure. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago about why in certain situations we're able to stop, think, and act, in certain situations we're not. And I'm being somewhat facetious here, but part of COVID-19 is we have more time on our hands. Most of us, not all of us. We have many people, essential businesses and medical providers that are heroes right now, but most of us have more time on our hands. And more time on your hands typically equals self-reflection. And self-reflection is something most people don't enjoy doing, because when you look in the mirror and you take a hard look at your strengths and your weaknesses and your emotional intelligence and how effective you are in your core competencies, you might not like what you see, which is why a lot of people resist self-reflection. But a lot of us, you can't help it right now because you have the time to think. And I share that because I'm giving you kind of a joke homework assignment, and that is take a few minutes later today or tonight, see if you can identify 3 situations or scenarios or kinds of people that you're more inclined to give latitude with and not jump the gun and stop, think, and act and respond. And think of 3 scenarios and situations that you may not, and see if you can discern with what the differences are in those situations and why you're able to do it in certain situations and why you're not in others. And I'm happy for you to email me and share that with me, and I can give you some feedback if you'd like to do that. But I would encourage you to take 10 or 15 minutes to do that, because I think you could learn something about yourself that would guide you in future communication and interaction with others. So look, the long and short of this: good pressure, bad pressure, no pressure. Good pressure, there is good pressure. Pressure that drives us to act and move and stimulates behavior. One of the things about good pressure, I always joke around. A lot of people will say to me, they'll procrastinate, and they stress about they procrastinate. And I say, honestly, how's it hurt you? Because if you procrastinate and you're still getting things done, and it really hasn't adversely affected you, then maybe you don't need to stop procrastinating. And I'm not being sarcastic. And to me, that's a kind of good pressure. And let's be honest, there's a lot of emotional and physical stress or mental stress that goes into procrastinating. But the point is, good pressure affects our level of reacting, responding. Bad pressure is when we're getting pressured by others, or this is an important thing of self-awareness. Bad pressure is pressure you put on yourself unnecessarily. It's you're telling yourself you have to do something, you have to achieve a goal, you have to start a habit. It's when you start shooting on yourself. And when you tell yourself that you have to do something or someone else has to do something in a certain way, if there really is no basis for it, that is creating bad pressure. And no pressure is what a lot of us are really adapting to in this react respond era, because so many of us rely on deadlines and structure and a sense of urgency established by a hierarchy to get things done. And now when you're working remotely at home, there is less structure, there's less sense of urgency, there are less deadlines in many cases, and it really relies on you to set those rules and guidelines. And what I'm finding out, a lot of my clients, what they're doing is they're doing the bad pressure. They're creating unreasonable and unnecessary rules for themselves. And let's face it, bad pressure and no pressure both have their downside. But the point is, it's been a real difficult adjustment for a lot of people to adapt to a lack of structure, guidelines, and timelines when they're trying to prioritize and create to-do lists and be task-oriented. So this is an important acronym that I hope you take away from today. And certainly you could take a look at it as I'm explaining it. What I want to explain this PLACE acronym, this came from a woman that I researched, Melissa Eisler, and it was really meaningful. And so the P, again, I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to share some general concepts about this acronym. The P, notice your energy shift. Again, I want to emphasize that reacting and responding is not only about anger. It's about disappointment. It's about fear of the unknown. It's about being lost. And so the question is, when you're feeling your energy or mood shift, that is the ultimate mindfulness and self-awareness. So over the course of the day, if you're not feeling motivated, if you're sitting in front of the TV, or if you're doing something that you don't think you should be doing, if you can catch yourself and say, oh man, I am not feeling motivated right now. If you can actually identify that, or if you were feeling motivated and all of a sudden stopped being motivated and notice that energy shift, that's what the P is all about. That is mindfulness 101, recognizing moods and energy shifts. Now the L, what are the emotions you're feeling? Now, what's important about this is to not only recognize them, but to say them. And as corny as that might sound, if you're in a big group of people, you're not going to yell out, oh, I'm feeling sad right now. I'm not proposing that. But I am proposing that you actually articulate the emotions you're feeling. Because if you, as you're about to race off to the supermarket and get 20 rolls of toilet paper, if you could take a step back and say, I'm feeling really stressed out right now. I'm feeling really, feeling like I've lost all control of my life and my family, or the people that work for me. If you could do that and actually verbalize it, that's that self-awareness, second self-awareness step, that by verbalizing it, you're admitting it and you're acknowledging it. And that's really important. The A is critical. Why are you upset? Like I said before, with the experience of the person coming back late from lunch, is it the event itself? You know, is it really you're upset because the person's late? Are you upset because the person, your boss promised you a review a week ago and you still haven't gotten the review? Is that why you're upset? Probably not. You're probably upset because either maybe your boss has a track record of not doing what he or she says they're going to do, and that triggers a sense of frustration, lack of confidence, lack of trust, helplessness, things like that. So identifying, again, is it the event yourself? Is it past experiences in this specific area, or is it past general experiences? The third is choosing a skillful response. And choosing a skillful response is based on a couple of factors, but the underlying factor in choosing a skillful response is, what's my goal? And how can I respond in a productive way? Sometimes when we hear people use the word vent, people want to vent. And so when you vent to somebody, especially if it's someone who's an important relationship in your life, what was the goal of venting? Do you really feel that much better? When someone cuts you off on the highway and you honk or you curse at them or you roll your eyes, do you really feel better? When you honk at them, do you really feel better? I doubt it. Because what are you trying to accomplish? Let them know that you're upset? They don't care. When people cut you off on the highway, they weren't doing it to upset you. They weren't doing it to piss you off. They were doing it because they were being selfish. They're late. They have to get to somewhere. And they're not thinking of you. They're not worried about how cutting you off impacts them. So when you honk at them or curse at them or open your window and flip them off, it doesn't do anything. And it's really an important recognition to make, because if you're going to be emotionally intelligent, if you're going to communicate in a specific way, the goal is, what am I trying to accomplish here? And I will tell you, a word I use a lot with my clients is disruption. And this PLACE acronym is designed to really empower you to stop you and ask yourself certain questions. Because if you ask yourself certain questions, then you will be able to stop yourself and decide, is this how I really want to proceed? Is this the choice I want to make? Now, I'm going to be wrapping up in about 5 to 10 minutes. I start a little late, so I'm going to go a little longer. I am going to stay around. I know some of you have questions. I noticed some alerts in the chats, which I will respond to, but I just want to, some people who are on specific timelines and can't stay, I'm just going to finish this, but I'm happy to answer questions when we're done. So what you're looking at on the screen is the Confident Communicator Rules of Engagement. And this is something I do a year-long training on that I'm going to squeeze into about 1 minute overview. So I just talked about choosing a skillful response. And I framed it under the guise of what's your goal? Does it help you reach your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? But the things that you're seeing, specifically the first 4 you see on the screen, these are your rules. These are how you can self-assess yourself. So when you're communicating with another human being, did you choose the right words? You know, were your words going to elicit someone being defensive or hurt or disappointed or angry? Was your tone right? Was it condescending or critical or judgmental? Were you listening to understand as opposed to listening to reply? Were you modeling good body language, and were you interpreting and responding to body language correctly? Being a confident and effective communicator is such a broad skill set. And one of the things I hear a lot of people tell me, especially younger people, when I say, tell me something that you already are really good at. And I'll say, I'm a really good communicator. And I say, well, what makes you say that? You know, what are your rules for being a good communicator? And they don't really have an answer. And I don't fault them for it. But the fact of the matter is, these are the criteria that makes you a good communicator. Executing these skills, recognizing these skills, and being able to model this behavior. If you're a parent, modeling it for your kids. If you coach sports, modeling it for your players. And if you're a leader, modeling it for your team. Because one thing we all know, if you don't know how to model behavior, you sure as hell can't expect anybody else to act if you can't act the way yourself, right? It's the old do as I say, not as I do. So I'm going to wrap up with this. From a review perspective, again, ask yourself the key question. Stop. What is this about? Is this about me? Is this about them? Is this about baggage? Is this about past experiences? Is this because I'm in a bad mood? Recognize the emotion. Recognize why you're feeling that way. Put the situation into context, because I got to tell you, at the end of the day, you know, a lot of people will say something like, it's not worth it, or I'm not going to fight this battle. The problem with that phrase is, are you saying that internally as well as externally? Because if you say that, but you're not letting it go internally, you're not really saying it. So not addressing a situation and suppressing your feelings does not relieve you of the stress and the emotional pain that goes into this thought process. Think big picture, blend logic and emotion, and recognize the choices you have. Couple of final thoughts. This is just a slide to reinforce the recognition of the cue that changes your mood and energy. And final thought on this is something I feel really strongly about. A lot of us will offer up the expression, what's the worst thing that can happen? The problem when we offer that expression is we don't actually continue the conversation with ourselves or others. We'll say it out loud, or we'll say it to ourselves, and then we kind of move on to another topic. To really make good choices and decisions when it comes to reacting and responding, it's a really important conversation to have. So it would look something like this. What's the worst thing that could happen? And then you lay out a couple of worst things that happen. COVID-19, toilet paper. What's the worst thing that happens? You run out of toilet paper. That's the worst thing. And you have to find an alternative. That's the worst thing. So do I really want to run to the store? And by the way, let's not even talk about the fact that when you run to the store, you're exposing yourself to the coronavirus. So when we're doing our pros and cons, I mean, that's just another issue entirely, but we'll leave that out for the moment. But the point is do I need to run to the store? What's the worst thing that happened? Or no, I could take a step back, recognize why I'm feeling this way, and make smarter decisions. And then there's always this. If all else fails, I can send you this slide and you can bang your head on it if that helps. So there's always that. So look, in wrap up, like I said, I'm going to hang around to answer any questions. I will email you all a resource, a very useful resource that you can keep for your personal and professional communication, emotional intelligence. I would love it. I'll do some posts after this webinar. I would love it if you did enjoy this webinar. Please post on LinkedIn some positive comments. If you don't, please keep to yourself. Just kidding. But seriously, I would really appreciate, I will add you to my newsletters list. We send out newsletters giving communication tips, leadership tips, emotional intelligence tips. If you don't want the newsletter, that's the beauty of unsubscribe. But I would really appreciate some feedback either via email or on LinkedIn when I send you this resource. We have a presence, we have a Mindset Go Facebook page, we're on LinkedIn. We have hundreds of videos on YouTube where I give tips. I have an I Communicate radio show that I do every Thursday at 1 o'clock, where you can, if you're not around on Thursdays at 1 o'clock, you can tune in to tunein.com while you're at your desk and listen. And I also send it out in the newsletter. And with that said, I'm ready to answer questions. So let me just open up the chat. Okay, so first of all, let's see. Okay, these are just nice comments. Okay, so thank you. What questions does anybody want to put questions in chat? I'm happy. You can send them to me privately, publicly, whatever, but does anybody have any questions before we wrap the webinar up? Okay, you guys are being shy, I think. Okay, with that said, like I said, I will email you out. I'm very appreciative and grateful that you joined today. I really am. It means a lot to me. I really hope to help people and add value and help people feel better about themselves. So again, thank you very much. And I do have one question that just came before I wrap up. And what is the best way to handle past bad experiences? And that's a great question, Vincent. And you know, what's interesting, I think when you look at bad experiences, and I can give you a perfect analogy or a perfect quick anecdote. There are several things. I had a good childhood. I mean, my parents did right by me. I had a good childhood, but there are certain things from my childhood. There were imprints or experiences I had from my childhood that really have impacted how I communicate with people, how I parent, how I how I form relationships. And I think a lot of us, there's a few steps in this, Vincent, right? The first step is, can you recognize the root of the bad experiences? When you identify the bad experience, can you identify the consequences of that bad experiences and how it impacts you today? That's the first thing. The second thing is recognize that when you do understand what your triggers are from those bad experiences, understand that you're human and they will impact you, but understand what you want to do about it today to be different. This is what I mean about accountability and blame. I don't blame my parents or people have been in my life that have created habits and behaviors for me. I recognize where they came from. I recognize the negative emotional, mental, and physical consequences they create. And I make a change and decide what I need to do to overcome, and so I don't have to experience those bad things again. And I have to tell you that I'm certainly happy. I do a lot of coaching for people. I do sales coaching, I do life coaching, I do emotional intelligence coaching. But what ends up happening when I coach people is it's a blend of all of them. Because let's be honest, if you say, well, you know what I need sales coaching, or I need to be a better networker, I need to be a better leader. There's a lot of components that go in to be successful in those areas and a lot of core competencies. So there's a blend of all. So the best way to handle them, Vincent, in summary, is to recognize them, understand the consequences they've created in your life, and either get some support to develop the habits and behaviors to not experience them again, or come up with a plan on your own. Any other questions? Okay, again, thank you, everybody. Again, you can reach me at info@mindsetgo.com or maltman@mindsetgo.com. Again, I will email you all. Thank you again. Happy to help. And if you need anything during this crisis or beyond, please reach out. I'd like to be there for you. Have a wonderful day.